for this City Council public hearing on draft legislation addressing dangerous ponds in our city and ensuring that all ponds have safer and necessary tools to prevent future tragedies here in Columbus. First, I want to recognize a number of folks that have joined us here for this hearing to provide testimony and input that have really been critical towards getting this legislation to be presented to the public today for feedback. I know we have a number of folks that are here with us, but again, want to thank specifically Director Scott Messer from Department of Building and Zoning Services, Karen Gray from Columbus Public Health, Department of Neighborhoods Deputy Director Todd Diefendorfer and 311 Customer Service Manager Carmen Duckins, and Deputy Director Micah Halloran for the Division of Fire. Appreciate everyone being here, as well as our Franklin County coroner being here with us as well, Nate Obermeyer. Over the past decade, we have had dozens of young children lose their lives in open water in Columbus. And many, many more have had near fatal incidents in our city during that time, in addition to adult fatalities. We looked across the media, and this is a stack of tragedy after tragedy, of news reports of young people who have lost their lives in open waters in Columbus. These tragedies have overwhelmingly occurred at man-made ponds, particularly those man-made ponds at multifamily housing developments. We have struggled for a long time as a community really to come up with some public policy solutions to address this issue. Looking across the country, there's been a number of cities that have tried to bring some proactive engagement to provide some additional safety. But today's legislation we're going to review and hear a comment from folks across the administration is really unique. And I think it's something that we've taken time to try and figure out what is possibly the best answer we can to bring the right solution here in our community to help prevent more of these tragedies. So with that, I'd like to turn the mic over to Karen Gray from Columbus Public Health to give us an overview on the problem here in Franklin County and in Columbus. Ms. Gray?
Okay. Hi, thank you for inviting Columbus Public Health to be here. We really appreciate this legislation happening after many years of this being a focus for us. We've lost several children to tragic and preventable deaths in these ponds. And the ponds are found in many apartment communities and neighborhoods throughout our city, a hazard in plain sight, but given very little thought. So we thank President Pro Tem Dorans and his team for giving this issue the attention that it so deserves and for pushing the environmental changes to make the neighborhood safer in our communities. So I have several slides of data that I want to share. The data do come from Franklin County Child Fatality Review. Our CFR team, which is short for Child Fatality Review, is a group of professionals from multidisciplines, including representatives from the coroner's office, police, fire, child protective services, public health, pediatricians. And we come together to review the deaths of children under the age of 18 in our community who are residents of Franklin County. And we identify trends and make recommendations with the goal of preventing deaths from occurring in the future. So 47 children died in Franklin County between 2013 and 2022. 53%, they died from drowning, and not all of these are in ponds, but we'll focus on ponds in a minute. 53% of the deaths were to children between the ages of 1 and 4, and Black children in Franklin County are 3 times more likely to die from drowning than white children. Specifically for pond drownings, we had 11 deaths over a 10-year period. 23% of the children that died in drownings in our county drowned in ponds. And again, Black children accounted for 60% of all child drowning deaths. And Black children accounted for 82% of child drownings in ponds specifically. So about a quarter of the children that died from drowning over that 10-year period did die in these ponds that we're trying to get safety measures implemented in. Sorry, that's what I just presented, I believe. And we do have images in this presentation throughout that show some retention ponds in apartment complexes. Children who are first-generation immigrants or in an immigrant family account for nearly a third of all the child drowning fatalities in our county. 73% of child pond drowning victims were first-generation immigrants or in an immigrant family. And you can see there's a makeshift memorial at a site where we had a child fatality. I'm sorry. So the drowning deaths in these ponds highlight inequities already shown to be an issue in child drownings. As I mentioned, Black children and immigrant children are at a higher risk of drowning in any body of water, but particularly more frequently in these neighborhood ponds. And here we have several of the news headings from articles of these child drownings. It's really compelling to see how often this is happening. And again, these are preventable deaths. So we have often heard in our child fatality review meetings when we're reviewing these deaths that supervision is a big issue here. And proper supervision is definitely critical. It's a necessity. But anybody who has been around children know they can be really fast and they're drawn to these bodies of water. So when some ponds in our city have been the site of multiple deaths, not just one, it's apparent that unsafe conditions of these ponds create a recipe for disaster when momentary lapse of supervision does occur. Drowning prevention experts recommend stacking layers of protection to prevent injuries and fatality. So our Franklin County CFR and injury prevention team have made the recommendations that you see in front of you right now on this slide. And it's truly our hope that this legislation provides recourse for those ponds that have been deemed dangerous and provides guidance for making neighborhood ponds much, much safer. We do have this hot card that we've been distributing in the community. We have a few copies of those here today if anybody would like one. But this is just to increase community awareness of the pond drownings. These are available in English, Spanish, Arabic, French, Haitian Creole, and Nepali. There's a QR code that's included on it, and that will take you to a landing page that does have more information on ponds and how to prevent drownings and reporting of the nuisance ponds. So again, thank you so much for this legislation that has been years in the making, and I'm happy to entertain any questions that people may have.
Thank you, Ms. Gray. I did want to recognize my council colleagues that have joined us for the hearing, Councilmember Weich and Councilmember Dayakauer. I don't know if you have any questions with the department or if anything you wanted to mention at this point. Ms. Gray, just a quick question, and I know I sort of mentioned this in my comments beginning. Columbus sort of stands out as compared to other cities in Ohio as we have had larger amounts of fatalities in these types of ponds. And I don't know if you could speak to that as, sort of how we compare to other cities in Ohio, which again is one of the driving reasons why we want to have something proactive here in this community.
I know we talked a bit about this yesterday. I don't have data for the other counties. I really am only familiar with Franklin County, but I know that we do have a higher incidence of drowning deaths of children than our counterparts in like Cuyahoga County and Hamilton County. I think obviously, we have an influx of people coming to this area now, and there's lots of apartment buildings going up across the city, and these retention ponds are always a focal point of those. And lots of these housing communities, to have a waterfront home and stuff, it's sold as a great amenity to have a waterfront property and things like that.
Thank you. And I know when we've had discussions with folks from the housing providing communities, so folks that are building housing in Columbus, and we'll get into talking about this here in a little bit, but one of the reasons that they have pointed out why this is very different here in Central Ohio is, I think, to your point about those development patterns, right? So when we look at so much of the multifamily construction that exists here in Columbus has happened in sort of greenfield, so it's like new building that has oftentimes had folks build a retention pond because of our stormwater management requirements. So this has been a very common way that folks have been able to meet those requirements or to build these ponds. Whereas if you look at development patterns, say in Cleveland or Cincinnati or in other areas, you've not seen that same type of multifamily construction utilizing the same type of stormwater retention that were required here in Columbus. So we talk about this issue being certainly not unique to Columbus, but when we look at how development patterns may have unintentionally contributed to this, I think is important to note why maybe some other cities don't have this type of legislation for them, but I think it's even more important for us to have it here for us in Columbus. Thank you. We're going to move on to outlining a bit of what the legislation does, unless any of my colleagues have any questions for public health at this time. And again, I want to thank everyone from public health for their work in getting us here today. So when we're talking about the specific legislation that's going to be addressing this is actually regarding a number of amendments to Title 45, our housing code. And while swimming pools in our community are required to be fenced and considered attractive nuisances under the law, we do not have any similar regulations or civil liability regarding ponds. So really, when we looked at developing this legislation was really about how do we allow us to have some type of regulation over these ponds in order to require safety elements when we feel like that is appropriate. So we look at amending our nuisance code. So this legislation will establish a public nuisance process for ponds that are near multi-unit residential development managed by the Department of Building and Zoning Services. Ponds are defined as, in this legislation as, quote, a human-made pond constructed upon private property that is used for multi-unit residential purposes, that is designed to retain a permanent pool of water, which is greater than 20 feet across at its widest point to the public. The intention is for this to be 30-day legislation, so once this is passed by council, it'll take effect 30 days after passage. So in essence, what we want to do is, again, amend our nuisance code to allow our Department of Building and Zoning Services that already regulates public nuisances within our community, but specifically to call out that there are certain ponds that should, in fact, qualify as a nuisance in our city. So the first question is, how does the nuisance process start? Well, it's very similar to what the current nuisance code is, but again, knowing that there are many ponds across the community, some of which, again, have been created for stormwater retention, but others have just been created as water features at some of these communities. So the question really is, how do we know whether or not a nuisance action is required, should start, et cetera? So first, if there is an incident at a pond, fire regularly communicates with our Department of Building and Zoning Services. This legislation would add a required notification that when the Division of Fire responds to an injury or fatality at a pond, that it will notify Building and Zoning Services within 14 days. This legislation would also require public health, if they become aware of an incident, to also disclose this to Department of Building and Zoning Services. Again, this is about ensuring that our departments internally here at the city are aware when and if an incident occurs, so that they can review that particular pond in order to determine whether or not additional safety measures should be required of that owner in order to make it safe for those that live nearby. Residents in our community will also be able to report potentially nuisance ponds to Building and Zoning Services directly through 311. So if a resident believes that a pond in their neighborhood is potentially a nuisance, they don't have to wait for an incident to occur. They can contact our Department of Building and Zoning Services through 311, and our folks in BZS will then review whether or not they believe that potentially that pond does in fact pose a danger, and whether or not there are additional safety measures should be taken in order to make that, again, safer for folks in our community. Once the Department of Building and Zoning Services had declared that a pond is in fact a nuisance, it will then work with the property owner and prescribe safety measures. The abatement that would be ordered may range from anything from fencing, additional safety measures, landscaping, or all the way up to and including filling a pond in if in fact it cannot be made safe for those residents nearby. Again, we've built in an appeal process, so if a property owner disagrees with what the Department of Building, Zoning, and Services is requiring of them, they certainly still have the ability to appeal directly to our Property Appeals Board within the city. One of the other key requirements for us moving forward as well is that all new ponds at multi-unit residential properties, not just ponds that are required by our stormwater drainage manual from the Department of Public Utilities, all ponds will be required to install a submerged safety bench moving forward. So this is something that, again, we're trying to make sure that any body of water now will have this type of safety measure built into it. Oftentimes, ponds that were built sometimes decades ago, particularly those that are being used for stormwater retention, unfortunately did not have this type of safety feature, which again allows for, again, a much more gradual sloping of that pond that tends to be less dangerous for folks being nearby those ponds. The other requirements for property owners will be required to place signage informing people that there in fact is a danger potentially from that pond, and providing, again, life-saving equipment such as safety rings to be able to be placed at those properties when and if an incident occurs. This will, again, allow for more proactive safety measures to be placed, and also it'll allow us as a city to better understand when and if there are the ability for us to bring in additional safety measures moving forward. Property owners are required to send a yearly notification to those that live nearby within those developments that these in fact are dangerous ponds. Oftentimes residents are unaware, particularly unaware if in fact a pond does not have that sloping, that may actually be a significant dangerous place, particularly for children to be nearby. Finally, what we're hoping from a timeline standpoint is that this legislation will appear on first reading on December 9th, and again with a final vote before the end of the year at Columbus City Council. So with that, I want to pause and particularly see if any of my council colleagues have any questions regarding the legislation itself. Councilor Browich.
First, thank you for kind of walking through that. Just wanted to confirm, clarify, the signage requirements is for all property owners, whether new or already existing?
That's correct.
And then for those who already have ponds on their property, if they wanted to proactively do some of the putting up a fence or doing some additional elements to reduce the risk, would they be able to reach out to BZS to kind of talk through that, or has that process been identified?
Yes, certainly. I'll let Director Messer speak to that specifically, but floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Yeah, just to answer your question, that's exactly right. They could contact my office. So if there were permits needed, for example, if it was a fencing or something to that effect, they could go through my office to make that happen.
Thank you, Director. Any other questions, council members? Thank you. I did want to ask a couple of questions of the folks from the departments that are here today, talking about the sort of mechanics of how this is going to work. Anytime we have different departments doing different things here, the question is how is that communication and how are those requirements being sort of transmitted between various parts of our city bureaucracy, but also then how is that being communicated to folks that are now going to be subject to this ordinance. So one, Director Messer, if you could talk a little bit about, so right now there is some reporting that already happens generally, but again, this legislation require a hard requirement for the Division of Fire to message, basically let your folks know within 14 days that an incident has occurred. Can you talk a little bit about how that reporting currently already exists and how this additional requirement for that reporting would be helpful?
Yeah, certainly, President Pro Tem Dorans. We have extensive relationship and communication systems already in place for a variety of different public nuisances that may happen. So for example, with the fire division, everything from cars that run into buildings or other types of incidents that might occur around our city, we already have an extensive network of folks that are assigned to partner with Building and Zoning Services to make sure that we're communicating on an ongoing basis. This legislation does add a more formal written notice requirement between the departments and ourselves within 14 days, but rest assured my expectation would be that that communication would occur a lot faster. 311 is automated, and so 311 calls come to us automatically once they're assigned to our department. As far as health department goes, again, we already have sort of an extensive partnership with them to communicate on an ongoing basis. So the good news is we don't have to really create anything new, but there is that extra layer of official formal communication so that we have a record of exactly what we're talking about more formally.
And my understanding, and this is some discussions with the Department of Public Safety, is that actually having that formal requirement allows the Division of Fire specifically to share more information with the department than may otherwise be allowed, given some restrictions on information around safety issues that may implicate federal privacy laws, those kinds of things. So this hard requirement actually allows us to be, to your point, sort of formalizing some things that already exist, but allows them to be able to share more freely than what may have to just stay in their shop because of those laws.
That is correct. They will have a little more leeway because of the requirement in the legislation to actually share some information with us. That's true.
And I think one of the biggest questions that we certainly heard from folks that may be subject to the ordinance is, hey, you're changing the nuisance law here. That doesn't really tell us what's going to be expected if, in fact, our pond is declared a nuisance. So, Director, I know we're sort of speaking in abstracts here because one of the points of this legislation is not to take, a one-size-fits-all solution. It's more towards what is actually the safety measures at this specific pond would be the most effective. So, while stating that, we're talking about in these abstracts, could you speak towards generally the kinds of things that the department may require a property owner to install that would help to address some of the safety issues that would be potentially remedied from one of these incidents?
Yes, thank you for that question. Again, I would call out probably two different scenarios. One scenario is as the legislation has indicated, there's a variety of signage and other protective safety devices and notifications. All of those things are required by all pond owners. So one remedy may be simply to make sure that we're enforcing those requirements and make sure that ponds who might willfully not put up the signage or do things that we've ordered them to do in the legislation, we may declare those ponds a nuisance. And the remedy may simply be that they need to comply with the statute in order to meet the needs that are required under there. You also had a slide in your presentation that called out a variety of things that we might require. Everything from, we've had cars that go into ponds because they're so close in proximity to the pond without any kind of parking bricks or parking protective measures. It might be installing something like that. We have playgrounds, as you mentioned in your slide, that might be too close to ponds and need to be fenced off or provide protections. Fencing around the pond may be an option. There could be some vegetative barriers that could be established, a buffer zone, for example, around certain ponds that might make the pond a less attractive nuisance for children. And it could go as far as you mentioned, there are a few ponds that have historically been more of a problem in our community than others. It might be that those ponds need to be eliminated if they can't be made safer to protect the lives of the children who live there. So there's sort of a whole variety of things that we would be looking at. We would partner with our friends at Health and Safety on a pond-by-pond basis to really try to deal with what we think are the most egregious problems. There could be environmental factors. It could be a pond that has toxic algae, or it could be some sort of treatment that needs to happen to the pond. There's just a variety of things. We'll be establishing an entire unit within code enforcement who will be dealing with these nuisance ponds, and we'll be able to deal with them as they come up.
Thank you, Director. Any questions from my colleagues for Director Messer? I did want to ask some questions for the Department of Neighborhoods, again, which is for folks that may be not familiar. That is the department that houses our 311 service here in Columbus. And as I mentioned in my presentation, that's going to be one of the main ways that residents individually can notify the city that they believe a pond may in fact be a nuisance. So I want to ask Deputy Director Diefendorfer about sort of how that process works, and generally how can folks sort of access that tool if they're concerned about a pond within their neighborhood.
Sure. Thanks, Councilmember. Appreciate the opportunity for 311 to be part of this process to provide these important protections for residents. 311 already works with Building and Zoning Services, as Director Messer mentioned, sending thousands of code enforcement requests over. 311 receives those requests a variety of ways. People can call in, they can go online, they can send us an email, leave a voicemail, any of those ways to provide that information. What we will do is, with the passage of this legislation, we will work with Building and Zoning Services to really identify what information 311 needs to collect from residents to make sure that information is clearly conveyed over to Building and Zoning Services so they have what they need to take the actions that are required under this.
Thank you, Deputy Director. Any questions from my colleagues? Great. So the final speaker we have to present at this hearing is the Franklin County Coroner, Dr. Nate Obermeyer, who I appreciate being a voice here on this particular piece of legislation. We know we're here to try and enact legislation to prevent tragedies, and unfortunately when those occur, they end up with Dr. Obermeyer's office. And he's been an outspoken advocate within our community about how do we be proactive to prevent these kinds of things from happening. So I wanted to invite Dr. Obermeyer to present here as well.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon, and thank you again, President Pro Tem Dorrance, for inviting me here and allowing me to give testimony today in support of the proposed pond safety regulation. Again, for those of you who do not know me, my name is Dr. Nate Obermeyer. I have the honor of serving as your Franklin County Coroner. I'm also a primary care physician and an assistant clinical professor of primary care at Ohio University, Heritage College of Osteopathic Medicine, teaching the next generation of physicians. All preventable deaths in our community are a tragedy, but even more so when it comes to a young child and young children. Drowning is one of the leading causes of death for children ages 1 to 4 in the United States. Open water is extremely dangerous for young children. One aspect of this legislation addresses ponds that are already recognized as unsafe within our community, and I urge everyone to educate themselves about the risks associated with ponds and to promptly report any hazardous ponds that they are aware of to the city, as we've already talked about. As coroner, I know firsthand the pain that accidental deaths can bring upon a family, and we can address those places we know are dangerous to prevent that pain in the first place. From my office's perspective, from 2013 to 2022, we had 11 cases that occurred in ponds. For those cases that occurred in ponds, 6 cases were children that were aged 1 through 4 years old. We had 4 children that were aged 5 to 9 years old, and we had one child that was 15 to 17 years old. As an example, in September of 2022, my office handled a case of a 1-year-old child who was found in a retention pond just 15 to 20 feet from their apartment. The circumstances surrounding the death are an unfortunate tragedy that could happen to any parent. The Columbus Division of Police had to call in their dive team, and they were called to conduct a search. It took the dive team approximately 25 minutes to locate the infant. 25 minutes. This was a tragedy that could have been prevented, and Councilmember Doran's legislation with the proposed solutions around these ponds could have saved this child's life. I want to thank you again for the opportunity to bring awareness to this really important issue and for me to provide support for this legislation. I'm happy to entertain any comments or questions the council may have. Thank you again.
Thank you, Doctor. Any questions from or comments from my colleagues? Appreciate you being here and sharing that story. I'm a parent of a nearly 4-year-old, and when you hear of tragedies like that, it's obviously pulls at your hearts. And when we think about this particular issue here in Columbus, there's no one single solution that's going to prevent every one of those tragedies. But we've spent a lot of time with a lot of the folks that are here today trying to figure out some measure of proactive enforcement that we could bring to hopefully to prevent some of these tragedies moving forward. So I want to thank everyone who's here, who's worked on this legislation with my office, certainly to my colleagues who have partnered with us on bringing this forward, and certainly to many stakeholders across the community where we've had a lot of discussion about how do we bring the right approach towards this issue. And those who have joined us here, either in person here today or have tuned in virtually, our goal with this legislation is to ensure that we as a city are taking a proactive approach towards preventing these tragedies moving forward. And it's my hope that we'll have this legislation on here for passage by the end of the year in a way that will put the right tools in the toolbox for our friends in the Department of Building and Zoning Services, certainly the code enforcement within that department, our friends at 311 and the Department of Neighborhoods, our public health folks, and certainly everyone across this community that believes that there are nuisance ponds potentially within their neighborhood. And that's one thing I want to leave us with here today is that once we have this legislation passed, we really will want our community members that are concerned about something potentially dangerous within their neighborhood really utilize that 311 service. As Director Messer said, they're going to have a team of folks that are going to be ready to get to work on this in a proactive kind of way. So not only do we need to rely upon our folks in the Division of Fire and Public Health, but also folks in our community who know what is dangerous on their streets. So with that, I certainly want to thank folks for being here today. If members of the public want to contact my office regarding this legislation, they can do so at 614-645-7994. They can also reach me by email at radorns@columbus.gov. And with that, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you, everybody.